The year was 570 BCE, and the Mediterranean world trembled at whispers carried on salt-laden winds. From Sicily came tales so horrific that even hardened merchants refused to speak of them openly, crossing themselves and spitting into the sea for protection. They spoke of a man whose cruelty had transcended the boundaries of human imagination, whose palace echoed with screams that could be heard across the valley, and whose name had become synonymous with a torture so ingenious and terrible that it would haunt civilization for millennia. His name was Phalaris, and he ruled the city of Akragas with an iron fist wrapped in bronze. But this wasn't merely another tale of ancient tyranny or political oppression. This was something far more sinister, far more personal, and infinitely more disturbing. What Phalaris created in his workshops wasn't just a method of execution. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare that would make even the most sadistic minds recoil in horror. Today, we're going to uncover the true story of history's most forgotten monster. A man whose legacy was deliberately erased by those who came after him. Not out of mercy, but out of fear that his methods might inspire others. We'll examine the archaeological evidence that historians tried to bury, the testimonies that were hidden in private collections for centuries, and the mechanical drawings that reveal the terrifying genius behind his most infamous creation. But more than that, we're going to explore how one man's descent into absolute depravity created ripples that extended far beyond his small Sicilian kingdom. How his innovations in human suffering influenced torture techniques that would resurface throughout history, and how the very mention of his name became a curse that parents would whisper to frighten disobedient children across the ancient world. The story begins not with Phalaris himself, but with the city he would eventually rule through terror. Akragas, known today as Agrigento, was one of Sicily's most prosperous settlements in the 6th century BCE. Built on a plateau overlooking the southern coast, it commanded trade routes that connected Africa with mainland Europe. The city's wealth came from its strategic position, its fertile lands, and most importantly, its ability to remain neutral in the endless conflicts between Greek city-states. This prosperity, however, attracted the attention of ambitious men who saw opportunity in chaos. Among them was Phalaris, whose origins remain deliberately obscured by ancient historians. Some claimed he was a native Sicilian, others suggested he came from Rhodes, and still others whispered that his true parentage was too shameful to record. What we do know is that by 570 BCE, he had positioned himself as a military commander in Akragas, trusted by the city's ruling council and beloved by its citizens. The transformation from respected leader to absolute tyrant didn't happen overnight. Contemporary accounts describe a man of exceptional intelligence and charisma, someone who could inspire loyalty in his followers and strike fear into his enemies with equal ease. He understood that power wasn't just about commanding armies or controlling wealth. It was about controlling minds, shaping perceptions, and creating an atmosphere where resistance became unthinkable. Phalaris began his reign of terror with seemingly reasonable measures. He increased military spending, claiming external threats required stronger defenses. He established new courts to deal with criminals more efficiently. He reorganized the city's administration to eliminate corruption and waste. Each step was logical, each decision appeared to serve the greater good, and each reform gave him more control over the mechanisms of power. But those closest to Phalaris began to notice disturbing changes in his behavior. Private meetings with his inner circle became exercises in psychological manipulation, where he would test their loyalty through increasingly degrading tasks. He developed an obsession with punishment that went far beyond justice, spending hours discussing theoretical methods of interrogation and execution with the enthusiasm that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable. The turning point came when Phalaris commissioned a series of public works projects that would, he claimed, bring glory to Akragas and demonstrate its power to rival cities. Among these projects was a commission given to a skilled metalworker named Phalaris, a commission that would create one of history's most infamous torture devices and establish Phalaris as a figure of absolute horror. Phalaris was known throughout Sicily for his exceptional craftsmanship in bronze work. His sculptures adorned temples across the Mediterranean, and his mechanical devices were sought after by kings and merchants alike. When Phalaris approached him with a special request, Phalaris saw an opportunity to create his masterpiece, something that would ensure his name was remembered for generations. The commission was for a bronze bull, life-sized and hollow, with a door in its side and a complex system of tubes and chambers within. Phalaris claimed it would serve as a ceremonial vessel for religious festivals, a symbol of the city's strength and prosperity. The intricate internal mechanisms were supposedly designed to create musical tones when heated, adding an element of divine mystery to public ceremonies. Phalaris worked for months on the project, pouring his considerable skill into every detail. The bronze bull was a marvel of engineering and artistry, its surface polished to mirror brightness, and its internal mechanisms precisely calibrated. The metalworker was particularly proud of the acoustic system he had developed, which would transform any sounds made within the bull into what he described as melodious tones. When the bull was finally completed and delivered to Phalaris, the tyrant expressed his delight with the craftsmanship. He invited Phalaris to demonstrate how the acoustic system worked, suggesting the metalworker climb inside to test the resonance personally. Flattered by the attention and eager to show off his creation, Phalaris agreed. What happened next revealed the true nature of both the device and the man who had commissioned it. As soon as Phalaris was inside the bull, Phalaris ordered the door sealed and fires lit beneath the bronze structure. The acoustic system that Phalaris had so carefully crafted didn't create melodious tones. It transformed his screams of agony into sounds that resembled the bellowing of an enraged bull. The brazen bull, as it came to be known, represented the pinnacle of calculated cruelty. The victim would be slowly roasted alive, while their cries were transformed into animal sounds, dehumanizing their suffering and creating a spectacle that was simultaneously horrifying and psychologically devastating for witnesses. The bronze walls conducted heat evenly, ensuring maximum pain while preventing a quick death from burns. The victim would essentially be cooked alive over the course of several hours. But the bull was more than just a torture device. It was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The transformation of human screams into animal bellowing served multiple purposes. It dehumanized the victim in the minds of spectators, making their suffering seem less real and more acceptable. It created an atmosphere of supernatural dread, suggesting that the gods themselves were expressing anger through the bronze creature. Most importantly, it demonstrated Phalaris's power to transform human beings into something less than human, to reduce his enemies to the level of beasts. Word of the brazen bull spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world, carried by traders, diplomats, and refugees who fled Akragas in horror. The device became a symbol not just of Phalaris's cruelty, but of the depths to which human beings could sink when given absolute power over others. It represented a crossing of boundaries that even the violence-accustomed ancient world found deeply disturbing. The psychological impact on Akragas itself was immediate and profound. Citizens who had once felt secure in their prosperous city now lived in constant fear of arousing their ruler's displeasure. The mere sight of the bull, displayed prominently in the city's main square, served as a constant reminder of what awaited those who dared oppose the tyrant. Phalaris understood that fear was most effective when it was unpredictable. The bull wasn't used daily or even weekly. Its power lay in its potential, in the knowledge that it waited silently in the square, ready to receive anyone who crossed the tyrant's path. He would go months without using it, allowing citizens to almost forget its presence, before selecting a victim seemingly at random and subjecting them to its horrors. The selection process itself became a form of psychological torture for the entire population. Phalaris developed a network of informants who reported on conversations, expressions of dissatisfaction, and even dreams that citizens shared with their families. No one knew what might trigger the tyrant's attention. A merchant who complained about taxes might find himself dragged to the square. A priest who delivered a sermon about justice could disappear in the night. A mother who wept too loudly at her son's funeral might be accused of showing disloyalty to the state. Contemporary accounts describe a city where normal human interaction began to break down under the weight of constant surveillance and fear. Neighbors stopped speaking to each other, afraid that their words might be misinterpreted and reported. Markets fell silent, except for the bare minimum of commercial exchange. Religious festivals, once joyous celebrations of community, became tense affairs where every gesture was scrutinized for signs of sedition. The tyrant's paranoia fed on itself, creating an ever-expanding definition of treachery. Initially, only those who openly opposed his rule faced the bull. But as time passed, the criteria for punishment became increasingly arbitrary. Someone who failed to applaud enthusiastically at a public ceremony might be deemed disloyal. A citizen who appeared too prosperous could be accused of plotting rebellion. Even expressions of grief at the execution of others became suspicious, suggesting sympathy with enemies of the state. Phalaris developed an elaborate ritual around the use of the bull that maximized both the victim's suffering and the psychological impact on witnesses. The condemned would be brought to the square at dawn, when the largest crowds could be assembled. They would be forced to confess their crimes publicly, though these confessions were often extracted through preliminary tortures that left victims barely conscious. The loading of the victim into the bull became a ceremony unto itself. Phalaris would personally inspect the bronze structure, running his hands over its surface and checking the mechanisms while the condemned person watched. He would explain in detail how the device worked, describing the heating process and the acoustic transformation that would occur. This wasn't mere sadism. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to break the victim's spirit before the physical torture even began. The crowd's reaction was carefully orchestrated as well. Citizens were required to attend these executions, but their responses were monitored and judged. Too much horror might suggest sympathy with the victim. Too little emotion could indicate dangerous indifference to justice. The ideal response was a kind of ritualized approval, expressions of satisfaction that justice was being served, combined with appropriate fear of the tyrant's power. As the victim was sealed inside the bull and the fires were lit beneath it, Phalaris would often provide commentary for the crowd. He would explain the victim's crimes in elaborate detail, often embellishing or fabricating evidence to justify the extreme punishment. He would interpret the sounds emerging from the bull as expressions of guilt, claiming that even in their final moments, the condemned were confessing their treachery. The acoustic properties of the bull created sounds that were genuinely disturbing to witness. The bronze structure amplified and distorted human screams in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The victim's cries would begin as recognizably human sounds of pain and terror, but as the heat intensified and delirium set in, they would transform into something that indeed resembled the bellowing of an enraged animal. This transformation served Phalaris's propaganda perfectly, allowing him to claim that the gods themselves were revealing the bestial nature of his enemies. The duration of each execution varied, depending on factors like the victim's size, health, and the intensity of the fire. Some accounts suggest that healthy adults could survive for up to 6 hours inside the heated bull, though they would lose consciousness long before death. The tyrant would sometimes order the fires banked to prolong the process, or intensified to speed it up, depending on his mood and the lesson he wished to convey. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Phalaris's use of the bull wasn't the physical torture itself. It was how he corrupted the very concept of justice in the minds of his subjects. Over time, citizens began to accept that extreme suffering was not only appropriate, but necessary for maintaining order. They developed a kind of psychological numbness that allowed them to witness unspeakable cruelty, while convincing themselves it was justified. This normalization of extreme violence had profound effects on Akragas society. Children grew up believing that torture was a natural part of governance. Merchants conducted business knowing that any dispute might result in death. Families lived in constant fear that one member's perceived disloyalty might doom them all. The city that had once been known for its prosperity and culture became synonymous with terror and oppression. The bull's reputation spread far beyond Sicily, creating diplomatic problems for Phalaris as other rulers began to view him as dangerously unstable. Trade relationships deteriorated as merchants feared traveling to Akragas. Military alliances crumbled as potential allies worried about associating with someone whose methods were considered extreme, even by ancient standards. The tyrant's cruelty, initially intended to strengthen his position, began to isolate him from the broader Mediterranean world. Yet Phalaris seemed to revel in his growing reputation for brutality. He commissioned artists to create images of the bull, which he distributed as gifts to foreign dignitaries, a practice that horrified recipients and further damaged his diplomatic standing. He demanded that visiting ambassadors witness executions as proof of his power, not understanding that he was actually demonstrating his weakness and instability. The psychological toll on Phalaris himself became increasingly evident as his reign progressed. Associates described a man consumed by paranoia, unable to sleep without guards, and constantly suspicious of plots against his life. He began to see enemies everywhere, interpreting innocent gestures as signs of conspiracy and casual conversations as evidence of rebellion. The very fear he had created to control others now controlled him, trapping him in a prison of his own making. The transformation of Phalaris from tyrant to prisoner of his own terror reached its climax during what historians would later call the Festival of Screams. In 554 BCE, 16 years into his reign, the dictator decided to commemorate the anniversary of his rise to power with the largest mass execution in Akragas history. What he intended as a demonstration of absolute authority instead became the catalyst for his own destruction, revealing the fatal flaw in his carefully constructed system of fear. The festival was planned with meticulous attention to psychological impact. Phalaris had spent months identifying victims from across his territory, selecting individuals whose deaths would send specific messages to different segments of society. There were merchants who had questioned his trade policies, priests who had offered comfort to previous victims' families, artists whose work contained subtle criticisms of tyranny, and even children whose only crime was being born to parents who had once opposed his rule. The bronze bull, now weathered by years of use, was polished to mirror brightness for the occasion. Phalaris commissioned additional torture devices to complement his masterpiece, including heated bronze chairs, spiked wheels, and crushing mechanisms that would provide variety to the spectacle. The city's main square was transformed into an amphitheater of horror, with elevated platforms for distinguished guests and carefully arranged viewing areas for the general population. But as the festival began, something unexpected occurred. The sheer scale of the planned executions, the systematic nature of the killings, and the celebratory atmosphere surrounding mass murder triggered a psychological breaking point in the population of Akragas. Citizens who had endured 16 years of terror suddenly found themselves confronting the full reality of what their city had become. The first sign of trouble came when Phalaris called for the initial victim to be brought forward. A young woman, barely 20 years old, whose father had been executed the previous year for allegedly spreading seditious rumors. As guards dragged her toward the bull, something unprecedented happened. A voice from the crowd shouted, "No more!" The cry was taken up by others, then dozens, then hundreds of citizens who had remained silent for nearly 2 decades. Phalaris, standing on his elevated platform in ceremonial robes, initially seemed amused by the outburst. He had dealt with individual acts of defiance before, and his response was predictable. He ordered his guards to identify the person who had first spoken, intending to add them to the day's entertainment. But the guards found themselves facing something they had never encountered: collective resistance from an entire population. The crowd's anger wasn't directed solely at the tyrant. Years of suppressed guilt and shame at their own complicity in his crimes came pouring out in a torrent of rage. Citizens who had watched neighbors die in silence, who had reported suspicious conversations to save their own lives, who had applauded executions to demonstrate their loyalty, suddenly found themselves consumed by self-loathing and fury. What followed was not a coordinated rebellion, but a spontaneous explosion of violence that consumed the festival in minutes. Guards who had terrorized the population for years found themselves outnumbered 1,000 to 1. The carefully arranged viewing platforms collapsed under the weight of charging citizens. The torture devices that Phalaris had prepared for his victims were turned against his supporters with savage enthusiasm. The tyrant himself, trapped on his platform as chaos erupted around him, watched his carefully constructed system of control disintegrate in real time. The bronze bull, his masterpiece of psychological warfare, became the focal point of the crowd's rage. Citizens who had been forced to witness countless executions now saw an opportunity for poetic justice that was too perfect to ignore. Contemporary accounts describe Phalaris's final moments with a mixture of satisfaction and horror that reflects the complex emotions of those who witnessed his end. As the crowd dragged him toward his own device, the tyrant reportedly maintained his composure, even attempting to negotiate with his captors. He offered them wealth, promised reforms, and claimed that his cruelty had been necessary to protect them from greater evils. But the citizens of Akragas had moved beyond the reach of his manipulation. They had seen too much, suffered too long, and compromised too deeply to be swayed by words. The man who had spent 16 years perfecting the art of psychological control found himself powerless against the collective will of people who know own complicity. The irony of Longer feared death more than they despised their Phalaris' fate was not lost on those who sealed him inside his own creation. As the bronze door closed and the fires were lit beneath the bull, the acoustic system that had transformed so many victims' screams into animal sounds now performed its function for its creator. The tyrant who had delighted in the mechanical transformation of human suffering into bestial noise became subject to his own invention's cruel artistry. But the crowd's reaction to Phalaris' execution revealed something disturbing about the psychological damage his reign had inflicted on Akragas. Rather than showing relief or satisfaction at the tyrant's death, many citizens seemed consumed by a bloodlust that his years of violence had cultivated. They demanded that the fires be kept burning longer, that his suffering be prolonged beyond even his own standards of cruelty. The celebration of Phalaris' death lasted for days, but it gradually gave way to a more troubling realization. The tyrant was gone, but the system he had created, the networks of informants, the culture of suspicion, the normalization of extreme violence, remained embedded in the city's social fabric. Citizens who had collaborated with his regime now feared retribution from their neighbors. Former victims' families sought revenge against those who had betrayed their loved ones. The bronze bull itself became a problem that the new leadership of Akragas struggled to address. Some demanded its destruction as a symbol of tyranny, but others argued for its preservation as a warning against future despots. The device had become so associated with the city's identity that removing it seemed to threaten the collective memory of their suffering and resistance. Archaeological evidence suggests that the bull was eventually dismantled, but not destroyed. Fragments of bronze bearing the distinctive acoustic channels have been found in various locations throughout Sicily, suggesting that pieces of the device were distributed as relics or warnings. Some historians theorize that the technology itself survived, passed down through generations of metalworkers who preserved the knowledge while hiding its origins. The psychological aftermath of Phalaris' reign extended far beyond Akragas itself. Other Sicilian cities, witnessing the chaos that followed his death, began implementing their own systems of control designed to prevent similar uprisings. The fear of popular revolt led to increased surveillance and preemptive violence against potential dissidents, creating a cycle of oppression that would plague the region for generations. Trade relationships that had been severed during Phalaris' reign proved difficult to restore. Merchants and diplomats from other regions remained wary of dealing with a population they viewed as inherently violent and unstable. The reputation for extreme cruelty that had once made Akragas feared now made it isolated, cutting the city off from the Mediterranean networks that had once made it prosperous. The intellectual impact of Phalaris' methods proved even more enduring than their political consequences. Philosophers and historians throughout the ancient world studied his techniques, not to condemn them, but to understand how they worked. The systematic use of psychological warfare, the manipulation of crowd psychology, and the transformation of public execution into political theatre became subjects of scholarly analysis. Greek historians like Herodotus and later Roman writers such as Tacitus examined Phalaris' reign as a case study in the exercise of absolute power. Their accounts, while condemning his cruelty, often focused more on the effectiveness of his methods than their moral implications. The tyrant's innovations in control and intimidation were analysed with the same clinical detachment that might be applied to military tactics or architectural techniques. This intellectual fascination with Phalaris' methods had disturbing consequences for later generations. Elements of his approach to governance appeared in various forms throughout ancient history, adapted and refined by rulers who had studied his techniques. The use of spectacular public executions to intimidate populations, the systematic corruption of justice to serve political ends, and the deliberate cultivation of fear as a tool of control all became standard practices in various ancient kingdoms. The bronze bull itself became a symbol that transcended its original purpose, appearing in literature, art, and political discourse throughout the classical period. Writers used it as a metaphor for divine justice, suggesting that tyrants would inevitably be destroyed by their own cruelty. Artists incorporated its image into works depicting the fate of the wicked. Politicians invoked its memory when arguing against the concentration of power in single individuals. But perhaps the most troubling legacy of Phalaris' reign was its demonstration of how quickly civilized societies could descend into barbarism when fear replaced justice as the organizing principle of governance. The citizens of Akragas had not been naturally cruel or violent people. They had been merchants, farmers, artisans, and priests who had built a prosperous and cultured city through cooperation and trade. Yet under Phalaris' influence, these same people had become willing participants in a system of terror that would have been unthinkable to their ancestors. They had learned to rationalize extreme cruelty, to find justifications for unspeakable acts, and to derive satisfaction from the suffering of others. The transformation was gradual but complete, demonstrating the malleability of human moral judgment under sustained pressure. The restoration of normal governance to Akragas proved far more difficult than overthrowing the tyrant had been. The social bonds that had held the community together had been systematically destroyed by 16 years of suspicion and betrayal. Citizens who had once trusted their neighbors now viewed them as potential informants or collaborators. The shared values and common purposes that had once united the city had been replaced by fear and mutual recrimination. Economic recovery was equally challenging. The skilled artisans and merchants who had once made Akragas prosperous had either fled the city, been executed, or had their spirits broken by years of oppression. The trade networks that had connected the city to the broader Mediterranean world had been disrupted by Phalaris' reputation for instability and violence. Rebuilding these relationships required not just time, but a fundamental transformation of the city's image and culture. The demographic impact of Phalaris' reign was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that he ordered the execution of over 3,000 people during his 16 years in power. A massive number for a city that probably contained fewer than 50,000 inhabitants. Entire families had been wiped out, professions had been decimated, and the social structure that had once organized daily life had been shattered beyond repair. Yet perhaps the most profound damage was psychological rather than physical. The survivors of Phalaris' reign carried with them the knowledge of what they had witnessed, what they had done, and what they had failed to prevent. This collective trauma shaped the character of Akragas for generations, creating a population that was simultaneously suspicious of authority and desperate for strong leadership, hostile to outsiders, yet fearful of isolation. The children who had grown up during Phalaris' reign presented particular challenges for the city's recovery. They had learned to navigate a world where violence was normal, where trust was dangerous, and where survival required constant vigilance against betrayal. These psychological adaptations, necessary for surviving tyranny, proved maladaptive for life in a more normal society. The psychological rehabilitation of an entire generation proved nearly impossible. Teachers found themselves instructing children who had learned that questioning authority meant death, who had been trained to report on their own parents, and who viewed compassion as weakness. These young minds had internalized the twisted logic of Phalaris' system so completely that they struggled to understand concepts like mercy, trust, or collective responsibility. Religious institutions faced their own crisis of legitimacy. Many priests had collaborated with the tyrant, either through fear or genuine belief in his divine mandate. They had blessed his executions, interpreted omens to support his decisions, and preached sermons that justified his cruelty as necessary for divine order. Now they found themselves ministering to congregations that viewed them with suspicion and contempt. The temples themselves bore physical reminders of the reign of terror. Altars that had been consecrated with the blood of Phalaris' victims, walls that had displayed bronze tablets celebrating his achievements, and sacred spaces that had been used for torture and interrogation all required ritual purification. But the spiritual contamination ran deeper than any ceremony could cleanse. Archaeological excavations in modern Agrigento have revealed the extent to which fear had reshaped the physical landscape of ancient Akragas. Houses from the post-Phalaris period show evidence of extensive modifications designed to hide occupants or facilitate rapid escape. Underground tunnels connected properties, allowing citizens to move unseen through the city. Hidden chambers were constructed to conceal family members during periods of danger. These architectural adaptations tell the story of a population that never truly recovered from their trauma. Even decades after Phalaris' death, citizens continued to prepare for the return of tyranny. They built their homes like fortresses, their businesses like temporary camps, and their lives around the assumption that safety was always temporary and security was always illusory. The legal system that emerged from the chaos reflected this deep-seated paranoia. New laws established elaborate procedures for identifying potential tyrants before they could seize power. Citizens were required to report suspicious behavior, creating an ironic echo of the very informant networks that had terrorized them under Phalaris. The cure for tyranny had become a milder form of the disease itself. Foreign observers noted the strange atmosphere that pervaded Akragas in the decades following liberation. Visitors described a city where conversations stopped abruptly when strangers approached, where laughter seemed forced and joy appeared suspicious, where prosperity was hidden and success was downplayed. The citizens had learned to make themselves invisible, and they continued practicing this survival skill long after the danger had passed. The Bronze Bull's destruction had not erased its psychological impact. Citizens reported nightmares featuring the device, phantom sounds of screaming that seemed to echo from empty buildings, and an overwhelming sense of dread whenever they passed through the main square where it had once stood. The Tyrant's masterpiece had burned itself into the collective unconscious of the city, creating a form of cultural post-traumatic stress that affected even those who had never personally witnessed its use. Trade delegations from other cities brought disturbing reports about the spread of Phalaris' innovations. Rulers across Sicily and beyond had begun commissioning their own versions of the bronze bull, often improving upon the original design with modifications suggested by escaped craftsmen or surviving witnesses. The tyrant's legacy was metastasizing, carried by those who had fled his reign and now served new masters with their terrible knowledge. These copycat devices appeared throughout the Mediterranean world over the following centuries. Roman historians recorded the use of bronze animals in gladiatorial games, where condemned criminals were cooked alive for the entertainment of crowds who had learned to find pleasure in systematic cruelty. Persian kings commissioned heated bronze chambers shaped like lions and eagles. Egyptian priests developed similar devices for religious ceremonies designed to demonstrate divine judgment. But none of these imitations achieved the psychological sophistication of Phalaris' original creation. The acoustic system that transformed human screams into animal sounds required not just mechanical skill, but an intimate understanding of human psychology. The precise calibration of heat, timing, and sound that maximized both physical suffering and mental torment represented a level of systematic cruelty that few could match. The legacy of Phalaris reminds us that civilization is far more fragile than we dare to imagine, that the distance between prosperity and terror can be measured not in centuries, but in the choices of a single individual. His bronze bull stands as perhaps history's most perfect metaphor for how power corrupts, not just those who wield it, but those who witness it, participate in it, and ultimately become complicit in their own dehumanization. The tyrant who sought immortality through fear achieved it, but not in the way he intended. His name lives on as a warning that the capacity for systematic cruelty lies dormant within every society, waiting for the right conditions to awaken and consume everything we hold sacred.